Donald Trump has reached an all time low in economic approval rating, with a staggering 59% disapproval and just 36% approval rating. The United States is having the worst levels of affordability in modern history. And what have large corporations done in response? Jack up the prices of goods, services, and experiences. Today, we'll be discussing how affordability affects more than just the kitchen, but all aspects of our lives. Today, I'm rejoined by my good friend, Rish. How are you, man?
Arjun, I'm fantastic. Thank you for asking. How are you?
I'm great. I'm doing great. So I'm really excited to get into these topics. So let's just jump straight into it.
Yeah, for sure. I think when you talk about affordability, I think it's best to start the conversation off with the minimum wage, or I guess the lack thereof. So when we look into it, since 2009, we've had the same minimum wage of $7.25. So let's do the math here. $7.25 times 40 hours a week. Let's say they work full time, and let's do 40 times 52 weeks. They take no breaks, no vacation. That person would earn $15,000 a year. Now,
That's
that is
ridiculous.
barely above the poverty line in America, and nor is it even close to enough to for anyone to support a family. But some people might be like, "Oh, Rish, only 1% of Americans live off the minimum wage." All right, let's double that number. Let's look at $15 an hour. If you work at $15 an hour, same thing. You make $31,200 a year. Again, in most places in the United States, that is just not enough to support not only just yourself, but an entire family. Maybe let's
Yeah.
say two kids and a family. There's just no way you could support a family off $31,200 a year. Now,
Hmm.
let's say that isn't enough. Even though 1/5 of America lives on $15 an hour or less, let's say we bump that number another $10. Let's say $25 an hour. 45% of the workforce, roughly 66 million workers in the United States, earned less than $25 an hour in 2026, according to CNBC. So let's take that number. $25 an hour times 40 hours is $1,000 a week, times 52 weeks is $52,000 a year. That $52,000 a year in most places is not even close to provide for your family. I mean, let's say for yourself, sure, but that just doesn't work for people who want families, right? So
Yeah.
I think the conversation on affordability needs to start with the minimum wage versus a livable wage. The reason we had a minimum wage in the first place was to, you know, have an acceptable standard of living so that no full time worker would starve. And out here, with this minimum wage, it doesn't even cover basics. Like it may cover food, but it doesn't cover like the basics that a human person would need in today's world. And
Yeah,
that's the
that's
biggest problem.
that's pretty egregious.
And then we look at Oklahoma. Like, what are we doing in Oklahoma? Just refusing to raise the minimum wage.
Dude.
Like, I just don't understand the the sort of mindset that these people have and like the problem with raising the minimum wage. Prices are already going up, so might as well have wages to match that.
It makes sense. They're one of the least educated states in the entire country, so they chose to vote to have less money, even though the prices are going up. Yeah, I think there has to be something convincing them of that because I just genuinely can't believe that a population is stupid enough to vote against increasing their pay. Like, I feel like there has to be some level of either just like full on propaganda going on in Oklahoma. I can't be missing something that drastic where they just completely vote against themselves and vote against their ability to provide for their family.
No, yeah, I completely agree. But yeah, like you look at this sort of like unaffordability. Arjun, what opportunities do you think are limited when like essentials become unaffordable?
You're not able to do anything that's like really fun at all. When essentials are unaffordable now, right? You can't take trips with your family, because a lot of families are able to take a trip maybe once a year to get away from all the stress at work, kids in school. But more than that, just smaller little luxuries like having soda every day, right? We think that it's just a microscopic thing that we don't really think about very much, but sweet treats like candy bars and soda are like really small things that add to our day and I would say life in general, right? But if you're not able to afford the essentials, who's going to be going out and buying a can of Coke? And who doesn't like a can of Coke every once in a while, right? So I think these small luxuries become impossible when you're not even able to afford the most important of things. Not only that, though, streaming services and things like that, right, have become much more expensive over the past few years. Some have even gone up over 100%. And things like dynamic pricing for concerts and shows and sports tickets, right? They make it so when there's less tickets that are, or like when the supply of the tickets are less, right? Let's say a concert's happening and the first ticket sells for $20. If there's now less tickets, they can change the pricing of those tickets to make it more expensive, right? And that can really hurt families. Things that are like microscopic little luxuries that people are no longer able to afford because of all the price increases across the board make it so everyday aspects of life become much harder to enjoy, and it adds a lot of stress to families, especially the parents of families, right, who are looking at all the finances and just trying to make sure their kids can enjoy their youth, but they can't even enjoy what their current situation themselves because they can't afford anything.
Yeah, no, for sure. And when you talk about like families, like you look at the amount of kids people are having, and I think it's one of the most one of those opportunities that become limited when essentials
Hmm.
become unaffordable. Like you look at a 2026 study. I found this study by Benjamin Colliard, and he said that rising housing costs since 1990 caused 13 million fewer births between 1990 and 2020, and that the high housing prices drove about half of the fertility decline from 2000 to 2019. So when you look at it, like it's like these opportunities that you were talking about, like not just like the everyday things that make humans happy. You also have that inability to have children and to foster our future generation, uh, and that like lack of building of a family in America.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point as well. I don't I think people are also not wanting kids right now specifically because of the unaffordability or affordability crisis that's going on, right? I think that people want to have kids, but I don't think people can afford to have kids. So they're like, why would I waste my time even thinking about something that's not possible right now because of how bad unaffordability crisis is in America, right? It makes it so you're not thinking about those kind of things, and especially when these laws like Roe v. Wade getting overturned, right? That's gonna scare women from wanting to have kids in general, right? If you have a lesser ability to have the right to an abortion, or in general, like it just makes all aspects of life more difficult, and it makes it so people are less happy and therefore less stable and less able to or less wanting to have kids.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And speaking of families, Arjun, what expenses do you think are putting the most stress on families in America today?
Wow. That's a really hard question. I think affordability in general is really hard because there are a lot of things that go into it at the same time, right? I think in general, prices going up across the board, right? Gas and groceries. When you have this level of inflation going on, it makes it so people and families have to choose between a doctor's appointment and between food for their family for a week, right? So it's just another added level of stress. And I feel like everyone obviously should be able to have like a doctor's appointment, for example, right? That shouldn't be something that we need to stress about. I guess we'll get to that later. But I think housing is obviously a pretty big issue, right? It's one of the most expensive times in the housing market, and it's just getting worse and worse. But along with that, gas and utilities, right? Especially from the conflicts that are going on, those are skyrocketing. Also, healthcare costs, right? Because those were specifically struck down by the big beautiful bill, right? $1.1 trillion of healthcare cuts over the next 10 years. That's really substantial, right? 911 million from or billion, sorry, from Medicaid, and over the next 10 years, and ACA cuts for 189 billion over the next I don't know, but it's just like when 16 million people are about to be like more people are about to be uninsured across America, right? What can we do to fix a problem like that? And not only that, right? When you have all of these things going on at the same time, but then you're also cutting like SNAP benefits to make it so you're getting rid of all the social safety nets, it makes it so much harder for people and communities to like, you know, have fun, like be together, be involved in their community because they're worrying so much about themselves, right? We also have issues going on with like immigrant communities across America, right? While immigrant communities are contributing significantly to our economy, there's all these immigration raids and mass arrests going on across our country, and it's preventing these communities from again getting more involved, and it messes with our economy, right? At the same time, especially when they're contributing meaningfully. And I think we can all agree, right, that we don't want to have like when we talk about like immigrants, legal immigrants, I think a majority of Americans can agree that illegal immigrants who commit crime shouldn't be in America, right? But I think an undocumented immigrant, if they're contributing meaningfully, they're not trying to cause any harm. They're trying to provide for their family at a location where there's opportunity, right? They're not receiving benefits. They're not receiving Social Security benefits. They're not receiving SNAP benefits, Medicare benefits, Affordable Care Act coverage. There's not really like they're not rigging the system, right? They're coming in because the process takes so long and they're just trying to be able to provide for their family. So I think it's a multitude of things at the same time that are making it harder overall rather than one main thing. But I think also the healthcare issue and housing are probably the most substantial issues that are going on right now.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think when we look at housing, I think we can look at, our younger generations facing a harder market, not just in general with the housing, but in general as like, adults. And I think the answer to that question is absolutely. When you look at four main key points, you look at the home price to income ratio I mean, it tells a bigger story. When you look at the median home cost is about 3.5 times the median household. In 2025, the median home was about $415,000 against roughly $80,000 in median household income, a ratio above 5 times. So when you look at the ratio between like home prices and income prices, that gap is so large than what it was like 30, 40, 50 years ago, and it's making it so that younger generations have a harder time buying homes.
Yeah.
Also, when you look at the wealth gap, boomers hold roughly 10 times the wealth of millennials and own about $55 trillion more. So when you look at that wealth inequality and that wealth gap, it makes it even harder for even Gen Z to catch up. When we're talking about millennials not even having enough weight in the wealth game as boomers, it makes it even harder for Gen Z to catch up.
Yeah.
And then when you look at wages, like we talked about the minimum wage being flat across generations, like it's been a generation since we've increased or kept the minimum wage at what it as right now. And so with
Mhm.
these wages being stagnant as they are, it's really hard for Gen Z to catch up. And then when you look at the younger generation going to school more, college more, you look at student debt, that being a whole new weight. Like the U.S. Student debt exceeds $1.7 trillion in America, with an average borrower debt to 30 to 40,000. That just wasn't the case back then. And so when you look at these different aspects of how hard it is for Gen Z to compete in the harder market, you look at these different aspects and you say, what can the government do? How can the government focus on lowering prices of goods as well as increasing incomes across jobs?
I think there's a few things the government can do, right? They could reduce things like tariffs and trade barriers. That would make it so we could get food from other countries and things like fertilizer that would help produce the food for cheaper, right? More people would buy their product. And then, as you said, like federal and even state minimum wage increases would help the poverty ratio, right? It's kind of crazy that people aren't able to afford homes anymore, right? I think it's like one third of people 18 through 35 are now living with their parents. That's pretty ridiculous compared to back then where homes were like $12. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of crazy that these kind of issues are so much more difficult to deal with now, and part of it in my opinion has to do with not taking care of the youth and not increasing things like the minimum wage and making it so they can earn like create wealth obviously throughout their whole life, but even younger they can try and contribute to, if you work a minimum wage job at 725 versus increasing it to 15, you're doubling the amount of money you're making for multiple years before you get into the real workforce. I think there's other things that they could do, right? We could talk about how they could fix the healthcare system, right? There's a few ways they could fix that. We could make private and public insurers have to pay the same flat fee for things like MRIs, for example, right? Which would prevent price gouging and increase the affordability of medical procedures. But another thing you could do is the public option, right? Within the healthcare system, it would make it so it would create a cap on charges for healthcare procedures, and it would also make it so it would make it so the system isn't Wall Street shareholder driven anymore, right? Now you'd have a system where people aren't profiting off of the selling of these products, so it would dramatically lower the cost of these goods and force all the other private options as well to lower their monthly premiums, right? You could take it from here.
Yeah, I think when you look at it, I think the biggest thing I mean, I've talked about this, raising the minimum wage. That would help with a lot of problems in today's world. I
Hmm.
also think that the government needs to, build. When you look at like Austin, Texas, and like Minneapolis became the first US city to eliminate single family only zoning through its 2040 plan. So I feel like plans like those, like efforts and policies like those can really help, you know, people buying like homes. And then when you combine that with like raising the minimum wage, honestly don't think it should be like statewide or federal wise. I think it should be region wise. When you look at let's say the border between like Kansas and Missouri, like the both Kansas cities, like the minimum wage in one state could be, let's say Kansas, cost of living there is much lower than it is Missouri. Let's say the minimum wage would be increased to like 15, compared to Missouri it might be 18 or 19. I think a 20-minute drive across the border doesn't really it doesn't really make sense for like a 20-minute drive to change like $4 an hour based on minimum wage. So I think it should be region based, like based on the city. Like the harder it is to live somewhere, the more money you should make. Like the minimum wage should be more. And I think like the lower it is to live, I think the lower the minimum wage of that region should be. So I think
Yeah.
looking at a regional minimum wage would be a lot better than just like a statewide or a federal minimum wage.
I have a counter argument to that. So the reason why I would say the federal minimum wage, I would argue it would be significantly easier to pass. I think the idea in itself is good, but I think a federal minimum wage would be significantly easier to pass through like Congress because to get it statewide changed, it would have to go through all 50 states in general, right? You would have to have all of the House, all of the Senate, and then the governor approve it in every state across the country, which I just don't think will happen, right? I don't think states are willing to do something like that, but I think changing the minimum wage across like changing the federal minimum wage is something that I think the nation as a whole might be able to put more pressure on rather than state by state basis. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, like the region based is a good idea, like in
Yeah,
theory, but I don't think it ever like amount to anything. I don't think there's any way we could like make that a thing. So I think I think the best we could do if not that is definitely raising the federal minimum wage. I think
yeah.
there's already a plan in effect about it being like $25 an hour. The Living Wage Act for All. I mean, it's already trying to raise the federal minimum wage to $25 an hour, and I think that would be a great idea.
I think there's a misconception. People believe that all prices will skyrocket as soon as the minimum wage increases, which is just not how it works, right? Like a business can't double the cost of like a cheeseburger because people are making double the wage, right? That's not how it works. People aren't going to buy the cheeseburger anymore, right? I don't get why and how people think that. I think it's just people are either assuming or wrongfully told that kind of information, but I think it's pretty harmful and might be able to explain why things like the Oklahoma incident happened. Was it last week? I think it was last week.
I mean, but just like looking at the government, I just think it sucks. Like, what do we do? Like, what could we do?
I think we need to elect candidates to. I think, first of all, this is a little bit separate of a topic, but I kind of want to get into this. How I think Democrats need to work on electing more electable candidates, right? I think the Republican Party, right now specifically, is struggling a lot to do that because Trump is just backing random candidates, right? And they just win. But I think Democrats need to think about, like, let's say in Florida, for example, I'm just going to throw a state out. In Florida, if you have a centrist Democrat, it is so much better to try and elect that person than a progressive Democrat, right? You're not going to get a progressive Democrat to win statewide in a state like Florida. Like, that is just a dumb thing to try to do, right? Versus going in Maine and trying to do it, or going to New York and trying to do it, where it actually can work, right? You need to have progress to be able to convince the other side of the aisle that the policy platform actually works, and then you can inch your way towards more progressive policies. But you're not going to just be able to convince super conservatives in the South that progressive policies are going to work for the state and think like they're not going to win the elections, right? It's just not. It's not sound. It doesn't seem like a great idea to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to have like more of a smoother progression towards like those progressive Democrats. I think those type of candidates, like we look at New York, like the only reason Zohran was able to win was because like New York is already like a progressive city. It's one of the greatest cities in the world, and I think because of its like progressive policies and its like attitude towards politics, I think they were able to win. But I don't think if you put Mamdani in any sort of other city, like let's say in Florida, if you put him in like Miami, I don't think he's winning. I think, yeah, I agree with you when you say like it's very hard to get these progressive Democrats to win these sort of more red states, and I think a sort of smooth transition, maybe even like a central or a centrist Democrat, that would work better than any sort of other plan.
Yeah, I think it's also really interesting because I think he has, however, I agree. I don't think he's gonna get elected in these like red states, but I think he has changed the landscape a little bit, right? I think it was almost unheard of to elect progressives across the country, and now after Mamdani got elected, he's one of the most popular people in office in the entire country. That's pretty crazy, right? I mean, it shows that his policy platform is actually working. And his policy platform was like really ambitious, and he was able to actually perform. And I honestly I think he needs to run for Senate or something, have a bigger voice than what he's doing right now, right? I think he's doing an amazing, spectacular job. And I think he needs to try and implement this more in Congress if he can. And I think really the only ways he's getting up from here are Congress or being a governor. And I think he would get elected either way, whatever he chooses to do. But yeah, I think he'd probably go governor before that, actually, because he would have more power within the state and try to fix the state as a whole, rather than running for the Senate. And I mean, you have power, obviously, you have like the ability to vote on legislation that gets passed, but right, a governor can have more say when it comes to like what they maybe want to or not don't want to like pass within the state itself.
No, I agree. Maybe we should leave this for another episode.
Yeah,
Get the
yeah.
fans coming back. We'll talk more about this, later episodes. But it was really fun talking about the affordability crisis and the problems that the government has and has been having. I don't think the government is broken. I think it's working exactly as expected. I think the minimum wage not being increased since 2009 is definitely not an accident. I think it's a choice nobody with power had a reason to fix. I don't think the system is failing. I think it's just not built for the average American. And I think it's a system working for everyone except the people trying to get in.